Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first AWARE webinar of 2026. My name is Dr. Susan Brannick. I'm a clinical psychologist and clinical director here at AWARE. Delighted to be joined by Joanna Sweeney, systemic family therapist. So as ever, what we will do is just give a few moments to allow people to join, and we'll get going very soon. So get settled and we'll get going shortly. So welcome again to those joining. You're very welcome, as I said, to our first AWARE webinar of 2026. My name is Dr. Susan Brannick. I'm clinical director here at AWARE and delighted to be joined by Joanna Sweeney, systemic family therapist. Just as people are joining, I might give a few words of introduction to our AWARE webinar series if you're unfamiliar, and some of the work that AWARE does. So you can find more information on aware.ie about our previous webinars. So we run these the second Wednesday of every month, talking about topics related to mental health, depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. Just to say as well, we've also opened a lot of our education programs that will be starting towards the end of this month and beginning into February. So they're based on cognitive behavioral therapy skills, understanding more about depression and anxiety, as well as our family support program and our mindfulness-based stress reduction. So do have a good look on our website if you're interested in finding out more information about those programs. So today, as I said, we'll be talking about supporting someone who may be struggling with their mental health. And as ever, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. So we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you have. We may not get to all of them, so my apologies in advance if we don't get to yours specifically, but we'll do our best to answer them. And if you are left with something concerning after our webinar, really encouraging you to speak in your own support network or speak to GP or a mental health professional. So that being said, welcome again, Joanna. Thank you so much for joining. I'll just give a brief introduction and you can jump in after if I've missed anything, but just to introduce you more formally. So Joanna is a registered systemic family therapist with her practice in the Northwest for nearly 25 years. Her work supports people across a wide range of contexts, relationship, life stages, and challenges. Her practice is grounded in principles of interconnectedness, curiosity, and creativity. Joanna has also contributed as a lecturer in family studies and as a social researcher. She brings both professional depth and personal perspective to her work as a single mum of 4 and now grandmother of 2. You're very welcome, Joanna. Thanks for joining this afternoon.
It's great to be here, Susan. Thanks for inviting me to have the conversation with you.
I'm delighted to be here and to have the conversation, as we said. So this is, I suppose, talking a little bit about stigma this afternoon and really drawing on your experience from systemic family therapy, I suppose, really to offer a bit more of an understanding of what might happen in terms of relationships, families, when someone might be struggling with a mental health problem, and I guess crucially what we can do to help. And we were just talking there, weren't we, about kind of where stigma sort of fits into this sort of idea. And I suppose my initial thoughts around that were stigma can often get in the way of help seeking, either for the person themselves. It can sometimes be a barrier in terms of how we understand mental health. And it can also be a barrier potentially for people who might be supporting a loved one. I wonder, Joanna, do you want to say a little bit about how we might define stigma first, kind of maybe briefly, and then I guess how it might show up in your experience in terms of helping families?
Yeah, I suppose, if we ask ourselves the question, how do we understand stigma? What is it? Stigma is basically when people judge or treat someone kind of unfairly, just because of something about them, like a condition or something about their identity, how they show up in the world, or by an experience they're having. And this judgment or treatment of them leads to kind of stereotyping, and being misunderstood and exclusion and shame sometimes as well. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people judge or treat others unfairly because they don't often understand or they feel uncomfortable with difference, or they've picked up stereotyping beliefs without even realizing it. Those cultural kind of beliefs. And we see that, across society, many different groups experience stigma, not just mental health. Sometimes it's kind of health related issues, chronic illnesses like HIV or AIDS or epilepsy. Sometimes it's about disabilities, different forms of disabilities, or sometimes, addictions or neurodiversity, misunderstandings, misinformation, or identity-based stigma, whether that's within LGBTQ plus communities or, racial or ethnic minorities, religious minorities, immigrants, gender non-conforming people, so identity-based stigma. So we see a lot of different forms of stigma. There's many more across society. And we know, as you're saying, that sometimes that the consequences of stigma is that this can actually violate our human rights, our access to opportunities, to not just jobs and education, perhaps through these misunderstandings or misconceptions, but also to healthcare and even to mental health care, where that stigma or that shame or that reluctance comes in, that it blocks that kind of accessing. Feeling like that, creates that sense of loneliness or disconnection through it. But we also know that stigma can become internalized. So it's not just about how other people judge us. We can also judge ourselves. We can feel really different, or we can feel less than. That's sometimes how it shows up when we internalize it. And really over time, that can knock our self-esteem. It can lead to very painful feelings of shame and fear and loneliness. And it can shape kind of unhelpful beliefs like, we're broken, or that, this is very fixed within us, And because of those beliefs, people might hide their struggles a little bit, and families can hide those struggles a little bit, which avoid talking about what's going on. And sometimes we might make choices based on fear rather than based on what we need. So, so it's important for us to think about that and have some compassion, So all of those things make really help seeking much harder, whether that's the individual, whether that's the family, it makes that help seeking a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So then people put off getting support until there's, significant crisis. That sometimes they might even doubt whether they deserve support, or their fear of being judged, maybe, in some way. So, and that we know only really compounds any mental health difficulty that somebody might be experiencing. And sometimes stigma also helps or stops people from offering help. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or sometimes they believe the stereotypes that they've heard, that there's nothing they can do to help, So it's about really being aware of, I think, some of the myths and information that's out there that fuels those stereotypes. It's not okay. It's not okay. Because in the end, there's that risk that, everyone stays silent, and the support that's really needed never gets kind of off the ground,
Yeah, I think that's really key, isn't it? And I suppose that's a really nice link between the two. It can stop people talking, I suppose, can't it, about what's really going on, whether it's the person who might be struggling or someone who's worried about them. And I think the word you mentioned there was shame as well. There could be a lot of shame and some of that sort of self-stigma, and maybe stigma around kind of family dynamics as well, about what's kind of going on. So I guess that was one of the reasons that we were really keen to have you on as a systemic family therapist, to start opening up the conversation. And it's a lot of the work that we do in Aware. I think in terms of tackling stigma, I think we've probably come a long way in a sense, and as a society, I think in terms of maybe talking about mental health. But I guess thinking about this webinar as well, that's probably different for different people, isn't it? So people might have maybe different comfort levels about how easy or difficult it is to talk about mental health. And you mentioned there kind of beliefs that people might have. Another one maybe is kind of that talking about it might make it worse, or maybe asking for help might mean that you're weak. And lots of different people can have that belief
Yeah.
at different
Yeah.
times as well, which might relate, as you say, to stigma.
Yeah. And I think that it is important for all of us to kind of learn about what are some of the myths and misinformation, so that we know what the facts are, in some ways, because you're right. I mean, that belief, that misconception that talking about mental health might make things worse, or that it encourages problems or labels people, when the reality is that, open conversation, number one, reduces stigma. It normalizes. We're all human. We all struggle at times, um, and we all need connection, that we're hardwired for connection. Neurobiology is helping us really understand that. And when we talk together about what we're going through, and when we feel understood, um, when human beings feel understood, they feel really connected. And when we feel connected, we feel calmer and more regulated, So I think that there's that one feedback loop there alone, that talking
Mhm.
about our fears of being stigmatized even, like
Absolutely. And
bringing
I
it out
guess,
into the open.
yeah. And you talk a fair bit about kind of those maybe relational loops and feedback loops. And do you want to say a little bit, I suppose, about what systemic ideas might bring to this conversation, and how we might start to make sense of maybe things like stress or anxiety and depression, maybe interrelationally, so between people as well as just something that's within one person.
Yeah, sure. Well, a systemic perspective, what does systemic mean? Systemic means we see things in everything as being in relationship, how we are in relationship to ourselves, how we are in relationship to other people, how we are in relation to something that's happening for us, maybe a health issue or a work issue, how we are in relationship. So that's what kind of systemic means, how we are in relationship, not just with other people, but to all those other things. A systemic perspective kind of widens our view of what's happening for people, widens the lens from seeing just individuals suffering a condition, to really understanding how relationship patterns, how the contexts we grow up in, whether that's, trauma or grief or bullying, poverty, discrimination, etc. Those things shape how we learn to respond or cope with stress. And over time, those initial coping strategies become kind of default responses that we carry into adulthood, and responses to stress. There's a huge variety of responses that we have to stress. Things like, compulsive caretaking in order to feel okay, perfectionism, needing to get it right, to feel, so that we can feel okay. Sometimes we minimize or ignore stress in order to feel okay, or sometimes there's more visible strategies of stress management, like addictions or compulsions and eating difficulties, ways of managing different forms of stress. So these are not conscious choices that we necessarily make. They're more kind of learned responses developed over time, and often outside of our awareness. And we develop them in order to really manage stressful circumstances, and they can include circumstances like our social environments, or the patterns with the people that we live, such as sibling relationships sometimes can cause stress, or, relationship patterns with parents or with grandparents, or within a childcare setting, or education, and with our peers at school, and or within sport, that we develop those kind of coping strategies, stress management responses, So if we look at, maybe depression and anxiety as well as being a condition, it can also be understood as a stress response, as contributing factors, and that's where that idea of a loop comes in, so it consists, if we take that systemic or biopsychosocial, that it consists of depression and anxiety can consist of that biological sensitivity, and sometimes that's kind of genetic or intergenerational contributing factors to that biological sensitivity. It can be, another element can be the external stressors on top of that sensitivity, and then on top of that, as part of the loop, the default stress responses that emerge because of those sensitivities and stressors. And sometimes we can get that kind of a real lived sense of powerlessness or even disconnection rather than just simply an illness, And neuroscience really supports that understanding. It shows us that, ongoing stress and that lack of agency or power, because we're stuck in that loop, really can trigger that cascade of hormonal changes, chemical and central nervous system changes, so then we're getting another part of that feedback loop. We're actually changing, our biology is changing because of that loop of stress, and hopefully we can explore more of that more of those kind of stress responses.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Joanna, because I think that's really clear actually in a sense. And I suppose for the attentive listener, they might be picking up, I suppose, that some of these ideas are, again, that kind of that popular question at the moment, isn't it? So it's not necessarily what's wrong with you, it's maybe what's happened to you. Maybe the systemic perspective is also asking, and what's happening between us in relation to this, maybe?
Exactly. Systemic thinking really helps us to see that loop isn't a personal failure, and therefore no shame. This is, as you say, Susan, it's about what's happening between us, as well as within us, as well as outside of us. So it's all of those things together. It makes and people often say to me, that makes total sense, that it's more than that.
Yeah. And Johnny, you had a lovely example that you shared with me earlier about a teenager maybe who might be experiencing stress and then how the parent might respond. Could you share that with us just to maybe make it kind of really clear for people how this might work potentially?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so if we think about, if we take a low stakes stress response. So let's imagine, a 16-year-old lad who's failing at maths. Whatever failing at maths might mean to somebody. So in the teen themselves, that produces a stressor. So, and then when they're stressing, there's all that tightness, tension, and then we're beginning to get stress hormones building up, and then those stress hormones affect our sleep, and we're sleeping less, we're getting irritable, our concentration is affected, because we know when we're, in stress mode, we're in that limbic brain, which is our emotional system, and the limbic brain triggers the adrenal glands to release all those juicy stress hormones so that we can cope with the stress. But that actually also being in limbic brain means that, our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, which does that lovely, beautiful thinking, can see the bigger picture, it can evaluate, it can problem solve. That part of the brain goes offline when we're stressed, when we're in limbic brain. So then we have, all those stress hormones being released, our prefrontal cortex is offline. And don't forget, 16-year-olds, our prefrontal cortex doesn't finish developing till we're in our mid-20s. The bad news is the latest research says late 20s now. So sorry, parents, But so then we have that loop beginning that stress, poor sleep, irritability, worse concentration, prefrontal offline, more academic failure, more stress. So there's the internal loop. Then if we think about what happens between us, the parent's internal loop, now the parent is seeing what's happening. We're getting really fearful. Then we start over monitoring. We might even criticize why, or make unsolicited advice. Why don't you? We can, criticize. Then the teen pulls away a little bit. And then the parent feels even more afraid. So increases monitoring and the teen pulls away more. So systemic language might say the more, the more. So that's what that loop is about. Now we have two loops, the teen's loop and the parent's loop, both of them compounding. And that's what we call amplification.
Okay.
And that's why sometimes family therapists try and seek out that point of amplification, that we can kind of interrupt that pattern a little bit, that we can name the pattern, see it more clearly, and maybe intervene so that the teen can feel a little bit more understood. That the teen, we're moving out of that blaming the teen is lazy and the parent is controlling to more really thinking about how do we regulate fear, in both of these people? How do we start communicating from real curiosity and collaboration, and also relational repair, and understanding is the first part of that.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful to maybe get a sense of some of those loops, as you say. It moves it into a space away from blaming, but maybe trying to make sense of what might be going on. I think you mentioned earlier, none of these are intentional. I suppose they're driven by caring, or maybe also from fear as well, or concern, or anxiety. And you had mentioned earlier there, I guess, some of the things we might do to manage stress, and maybe over caring, I think you mentioned, or doing a lot. So I would imagine there's probably things that might decrease the intensity of those loops, or as you mentioned, kind of amplify them. So if someone was listening and thinking, okay, where would I start then in terms of supporting someone maybe who has a good awareness, we can have these conversations, and maybe also someone who may not join you in that curious sort of place of trying to understand a bit better what's happening.
Yeah, you mean when there's conflict in that? Is
Or,
that
well, I
what you
guess,
mean,
or
Susan?
even maybe even just generally, I suppose, where someone might start, if what you're saying maybe might resonate in terms of kind of where the person might be experiencing something, and then kind of that relational piece feels very relevant. What might someone do? How would you support somebody, do you think?
Yeah, well, I suppose first of all, we kind of recognize when someone is struggling,
Yeah.
and rather than maybe jumping to conclusions, that we explore that, with curiosity, in terms of, what's going on for you, and encouraging them to speak a little bit more about it. I think the other thing is about really asking the question, how do we kind of co-create that a wellness environment, when someone is struggling. So I think that's when we see that each of us plays a role, each of us plays a very important role in creating that recovery environment, and not just, as we've seen, because one person is in a loop. It's because we all become part of a loop then, So I think that's important. What are the kind of elements to co-creating that kind of, environment, getting to know, for example, if your loved one has difficulties, how it's showing up, what are the symptoms, what are the triggers, and learning how does stress affect our thinking, how does it affect our emotions and our behavior and our relationship, for all of us, not just the person suffering, but how do we respond to their stress, what's our stress response to their stress. That's the loops, that So understanding the feedback loops too, and the neurobiology underneath it, very simply, between our emotional brain and which brain are we using? Are we using our emotional brain to figure stuff out, or we're using our thinking brain? And to recognize that for all of us, when we get, really emotional, that our thinking brain goes a little bit offline. There's not as much logic or empathy, when any of us are stressed. I think one of the other things is learning how to manage stress in healthy ways. So becoming aware of our default responses. What do we do? Personally, I clean, or like for today's webinar, might be over preparing, so we all have, different ways of coping with stressors. So recognizing and then learning how to self-regulate as we come into a conversation with our loved one who's struggling. If we're not regulated ourselves, then, I know we spoke briefly before our conversation today about, the neurobiology. We have what's called mirror neurons in our brain, which means if we're not calm, the other person is picking up that too. And then neither of us are calm enough, calm enough. But we can harness those mirror neurons, that if we can self-regulate. So if we can what does self-regulation mean? It means letting go the tightness, tension that's in our body. That helps us to come out of our limbic emotional brain. And when we are calmer, so letting go the tightness, tension, we're releasing what they call the love drugs, the love hormones, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, dopamine, all those lovely calming hormones. And because of mirror neurons, the other person picks that up. So it's very different to acting calm. Acting calm doesn't release those hormones. So that's a really important part of responding to someone who's in distress, is being able to regulate ourselves first. And that doesn't mean acting like we're calm, So, and we can learn emotion regulation techniques. They're very easy to do. It means, dropping the shoulders, relaxing every muscle that we can think of, checking in through the body, take that kind of lift down to the basement, let gravity help you, just relaxing your body and, feeling gravity help you to do that. And it only takes a few seconds. It's very different to meditation, perhaps, or even, some very helpful breathing techniques. They're quite useful, but, emotional regulation while we're talking with someone, sometimes it's just as simple as letting go the tightness, tension, So they're kind of some of the things.
Yeah, no, that's great, Joanna. It's a really good distinction, isn't it, between acting calm, we probably all do that from time to time, don't we? Versus actually feeling calmer to be able to have this kind of conversation or interaction. That's really key. I suppose it makes me think as well, you have to be able to have a sense that you are tense as well, though, don't you? Like, you have to kind of have a level of being in tune with that. And certainly it can be very challenging in the moment. It might be after you think, gosh, I was really escalated, didn't quite realize how much. So I think you make some really important points there as well about what might be, if you're concerned about a loved one, or what might be your own triggers, or how do you manage stress yourself, and having that kind of awareness, so you're kind of bringing awareness to that side of the loop potentially. Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because we all have, stress responses that we do without thinking about it. So it's a reaction, and so taking that, some parenting programs call it pressing the pause button to say, okay, something's happening. Let me regulate first.
Yeah.
So before we, even ask a question, before we, respond to anything, we just do that kind of, check in with our body. Am I holding tightness, tension? which is emotion. We know that,
Yeah.
we don't think emotion, we feel it in our bodies. It's some form of tightness, tension. That's emotion, and they're there for good reason. Nature gave us a beautiful landscape of emotions. The purpose of emotions, and people might disagree with me here, but but the purpose of emotions is to signal need. So when we have all those feel good emotions, we know that our needs are being met. When we have the more uncomfortable emotions, it means our needs are not being met. So they're important signals, but they're just signals. They're signaling something very important. So nature gave us emotions so that we can thrive, because when we meet our needs for connection, our needs for being understood, our needs to, be creative, so our need for respect, for equality, when our needs are being met, then we're in that state of flow and equilibrium, in balance, and that's what nature designed us to seek out, and that's why we have those emotions. They're signals. So when an emotion shows up, we can appreciate it, acknowledge it, and also then use it. So what is this signaling? What need of mine isn't being met or is being met, and what we do with that. So I think that's kind of a useful way of thinking about them.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's really helpful. And I guess thank you to those watching putting in the questions. So please feel free to ask any questions that arise as we go. And as I said, we'll do our best to answer them. I might just take one here now. So thank you to everyone, as I said, who's put forwarding questions. This is about psychological safety, so maybe it relates a little bit to what we're talking about. I guess just thinking about how you might have conversations with people. How this person is asking, how might you consider building psychological safety in these contexts? We've spoken a little bit to it maybe so far, but you might build on that.
Well, we know the first step in creating safety and psychological safety is about being regulated ourselves. Do you know? When we're regulated ourselves, we're releasing all of those safe hormones, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, dopamine. And those mirror neurons is the first step in creating a little bit of safety. Another form of creating psychological safety, I suppose, in the in-between is curiosity. Being curious, without rushing in with solutions or suggestions. Solutions and suggestions does not create safety, believe it or not. It might feel safer for us because then we feel like we're doing something, but it can generate, be that kind of being shamed that that they're being told what to do. I also think that creating psychological safety is and using that curiosity to seek to be understood, that being understood creates a form of safety as well. Pacing creates a form of safety, and being able to approach, healthy conflict resolution, is so, so important. And understanding, especially within, families, if we think of one person in a family, when one person in a family is living with depression or anxiety, the illness doesn't stay contained in that person. It, shapes or impacts the whole household, because there's love and there's concern and there's care, and concern and worry it releases stress hormones, and many of the conflicts that arise, aren't really about personality or effort. They come from a kind of a collision between illness-driven behaviors and caregiver strain, and so being able to manage conflict well is about, first of all, taking a kind of a starting point, rather than seeing depression or anxiety as a lack of something, whether carers sometimes feel a person isn't just trying enough, they're not engaging enough, or they're not following through enough, or the anxious person, they might be an anxious person might already be operating at an absolute limit. So understanding that rather than judging that. So we're moving then from, you don't care to I just can't, and I suppose really understanding that part of it. So understanding creates and curiosity creates that psychological safety. I don't know, maybe you want to add something to that, Susan, as well.
I think that's great, actually. I think it's really, there's so many things I want to pick up on. Maybe one of the, and this is something that comes up a lot in terms of supporting people. I guess, as you say, it can be quite reassuring to offer a solution for us as whatever we move between these roles, I think, but for the person maybe supporting, but that may not create safety for the person, as you said. So I think that's maybe a really key point, that it might actually feel quite shaming. It might not be beneficial. And I suppose maybe, I'm not sure if you might have the same experience, but I suppose people often come to therapy having tried a multitude of things. So there's many things that they might have looked at and worked at. So I guess kind of coming with a solution doesn't always kind of honor that, in a sense. So they have a fair amount of it. Someone will have a lot of experience of what's worked and possibly not worked, and the reasons it can be difficult. So that's maybe something really key to kind of hold on to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, I suppose there's conflicts between seeing offering help as feeling controlled,
Yeah.
a little bit, and how do we because as carers, we kind of step in to remind or to prompt or organize or to push a little bit, or even protect, and over time that can feel like maybe micromanaging or surveilling almost, and then the person suffering can kind of experience that they might feel like they're being treated like a child, or that they're constantly being kind of watched, and that can increase kind of shame and anxiety, and then they might withdraw even more. So that's, and then the carer feels, whoever's providing that care can feel really kind of unappreciated, or pushed away, rejected. And so that's creating another kind of feedback loop, as it were, So I think, what sometimes can help to avoid that surveillance environment, kind of, we can add, before we try and rush in and help someone, we ask, do you want our support, or do you need space? Um, we kind of create an opt-in support menu. Well, look, I can remind you if you want, or I can sit with you, or I can do it with you, or I can leave you alone. Which do you want today? So it's like multiple choice, you tell me. So they're in the driving seat. We're giving options, but they decide what that looks like. But of course, don't forget that, obviously safety issues are different to preferences. When there's a safety issue, that kind of we override autonomy a little bit. Then if there's a genuine risk, when there's an issue for safety, and if there is an issue around safety, and we know that, for the carer, they're saying, I'm scared for you. The person who's suffering is saying, but I feel trapped, you know.
Mm.
And depression, we know in particular, can cause a lot of hopelessness and anxiety. It increases that overwhelm of constantly being in threat mode. And carers can feel like this impending doom and
Mm.
catastrophe. And so sometimes people feel like they're being treated as, ultra fragile. So what helps then? Well, we can make um, shared safety plans in advance,
Yeah.
talk about that on the good days. So on
Yeah.
the good days, we don't away, we can agree what's a warning sign, or we can agree what helps, what doesn't, and agree when to intervene on the good days, and we can, use very collaborative language. What
Mm.
would you need to? What would help you feel safer and feel freer? In those moments. Um, so yeah, I think that being able to kind of resolve conflicts around
Mm.
whether that's, safety and independence, or, honesty and openness, or protecting ourselves, being able to kind of talk those conflicts through. And
Yeah.
sometimes we might need a bit of help, maybe a bit of outside practice first,
Mm.
in resolving some of those conflicts. Family therapists certainly are, well positioned to do that. Do you
Yeah.
know?
It can certainly be a very helpful resource, can't it? And I suppose I'm thinking about as well, because that's a lovely description, as you say, kind of agreeing that safety plan maybe in advance, quite key, maybe not doing that in the heat of the moment, but when things are calm on better days. And I suppose something that comes up a lot is for people who might be concerned about someone who may not be able to meet them in that conversation. They may have a very different, you might have very different views about what's safe and not safe, and what I don't know what your experience might be of that, or if someone was listening now thinking that's great, but the person I'm worried about really struggles to communicate with me, or sees it very differently to how I see it.
Yeah, well, as I say, sometimes, if there is a really big disconnect,
Mm.
then, having those curious conversations. Tell me how you see it.
Yeah.
Really, I suppose, sometimes I think about, that wonderful way of working, called open dialogue. I don't know
Mm.
whether
Yeah.
and or whether the people listening are familiar with it. Open dialogue is a way of I suppose bridging that gap
Yeah.
of making space, to hearing deeply what people, even though they might see things very differently, kind of bearing witness to what the other person is deeply, thinking and feeling, can be, really important. And I'm not sure, we probably don't have time to to explore open dialogue,
Mm.
or even the nonviolent resistance, approach is a great way too, of when we're really on very, very different pages, how it can help, to deconstruct how those disagreements are happening, and we can shift from, I think it's really important, shift from convincing to
Mm.
more, accommodating. Do you know?
Mm.
We can't, if someone's stuck in their limbic brain, and obviously we are joining them at times, convincing isn't going to help, you know. So we can talk more specifically about, rather than diagnosis, or that we can
Mm.
talk about, well, I see what I see. So I see your energy is low. I see that you're struggling with sleep, or I see that you're fearful at the moment, or I see that you're stressed or overwhelmed. We don't have to call it, you need treatment for your depression, So we offer help in small ways. Would you like me to sit with you? Would you like to go for a walk? Do you want me to, text the doctor for you? Small things, and framing it more as what would provide relief for you? Because I see you suffering. What small thing can we do to contribute to providing some relief here together?
Well, that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you, Joanna. Thank you to everyone asking questions. Hopefully, there was a question in there about maybe a younger son and how to, I guess, acknowledge distress and motivate them without generating conflict. So I think your answer is sort of broadly gotten to that. I might take another question if it's okay. Um, I guess in terms of how you might, a question came in maybe certainly maybe in a spousal relationship and children at home, if your partner might be struggling with depression or anxiety, how you might support the family to understand what's going on for that person and how they might be supported, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's quite broad, depending on the ages of the children, because
Yeah,
we do want a kind of open dialogue and age-appropriate
yeah.
conversations, you know, and sometimes I think that phrase of being able to ask curious questions,
Mm,
you know. Depending on the age of the children, what do they know already? What do they experience already? How are they making sense of themselves, what's happening? So we're checking
mm,
out what's their current understanding, how did they see it, what do they need? Are there times when they're really, really worried about, the parent, that's suffering, you
mm,
know? Um, and to acknowledge these feedback loops, because even as kids we're developing those stress responses, and we want to keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't feel responsible for a parent. Depending on the age of the child, children are what we call egocentric, so that means that if there's something that's difficult that's happening in their environment, they kind of see that maybe that they are causing it or they're contributing to it in some way.
mm,
So we need to make sure that bit isn't happening, that they're not responsible for this. So even when a
mm,
parent might get a bit irritable or frustrated, it doesn't mean that they're doing something wrong. It just means that the parent might need a little bit of space, or a little bit of me time, or and we can give them that little bit of time out, without walking on eggshells,
yeah. I guess it's that balance, isn't it, as you're saying about that kind of menu in terms of what's going to be helpful, maybe for the person, but also for the family dynamic too. Kind of what do
That's
people
right.
need in this, maybe?
Yeah,
Sometimes there may be competing needs, but it's trying to be curious about that potentially. And I think maybe the one of the key things that I'm hearing from you is really communication, isn't it? So it's those maybe, as you mentioned, open dialogue, which is great. So we can certainly send links in the after email for that, because I think it's a really helpful approach. Certainly, it's coming into more mental health services here in Ireland, isn't it? Certainly in the UK, it's very popular as a way
yeah.
to maybe. It seems straightforward in a sense, doesn't it? It's about having a conversation, really, but
It's
it's
it's it's very logical, but
yeah,
I suppose it is about slowing things down. And when we're
yeah,
stressed, it's the opposite. When we're stressed, we want to speed things up. We want
yeah,
to get going. We want to fix it. You know, and open dialogue kind of invites us to slow that down a little bit more, to regulate, so that we can come into, because that prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of the brain, that's where we're curious, but
yeah,
it's also where we have social engagement, so
yeah,
yeah, slowing it down helps us connect.
yeah. And I guess just, and again, thank you for the comments and questions. Someone had mentioned that in the earlier comments. I think it's probably a really key one. You've certainly said it throughout as well. Haven't you, Joanna, about the kind of connection piece is really key. And I think that maybe feeds into the psychological safety as well as being regulated. It's very hard to connect with someone when you're very stressed out or anxious. It's
Yeah,
going to be,
yeah,
it's going to
yeah,
be really tricky. So but also that connection piece can allow a space for a more slower, deeper conversation potentially, where you can say things that might feel a little bit unusual, or kind of you can maybe share some more of those vulnerabilities. I see that you're not sleeping and I feel worried about it.
Yeah.
I see that you're
Yeah.
struggling and I'm not sure what to do. So kind of
Yeah.
starting those conversations can
Hmm.
be key. So
Hmm.
thank you all
And
for,
sorry, go ahead. No,
I
and
was,
I'd say one of the other things is to try and if we're self-regulating, we're reducing down that high expressed emotion, even worry sometimes when
yeah,
we're saying, I'm so worried about you. That's high expressed emotion, which can fuel,
yeah,
being stuck in limbic. So being able to say it without
yeah. Yeah.
expressing and or living out the emotion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually. That's really key, isn't it? Because it's just going to amplify again, thinking about our loops, it's going to increase that and maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
contribute to stress. So I suppose it's starting to think about some of these ideas, and I hope they're helpful to the people watching. As I said, thank you for all the comments and questions to the people maybe who shared some experiences as we've been talking about stress and anxiety, who shared your own. Thank you for sharing them. I'd really encourage you maybe to speak to your GP, maybe have a look at our website, aware.ie, if you're really struggling with these experiences of anxiety or low mood. It's really important to get the right help, which is available and out there. So do speak to someone maybe if you've been left with anything after this webinar, or if you're kind of noticing actually some of this anxiety is stopping you doing what you want, whether that's a class or whether that's work or relationships. If that's impacting you to that level, it's probably worth speaking to someone. Maybe GP is a good first point of call for that. Um, just kind of moving towards wrapping up for this afternoon, Joanna. I think we could speak for ages. I think it's really helpful to have this systemic perspective. What I like about it is it is very non-blaming, actually, isn't it? So in doing that, actually that opens up a landscape for conversations, which can then open up possibilities for change. That's really key, isn't it? So people aren't
Lovely.
left feeling that things won't be different or nothing's going to work, that kind of idea.
Yeah, it
Um,
generates hope.
yeah, absolutely. Is there anything, I guess, kind of for the people watching, anything that you kind of would most want people to take away with them, or from what you've kind of covered, what do you think is kind of, it's a bit of an unfair question because I think all of it's important, but what for you is really key, do you think?
Well, I think, as you've said, Susan, we're all in it together, you
Yeah.
know, and hopefully creating a kind of a scaffolding together.
Mm,
We're both challenging stigma, having open conversations. That helps us to seek help. We having a shared understanding of symptoms and how the symptoms impact on our physiology, even, how to stay regulated, how to offer co-regulation so that bit when we're calm, it helps the other. How, important it is to try and resolve conflicts, lower emotion and resolve, see it from the other person's point of view a little bit, and how to manage our own stress responses, and all of those things help provide relief. It can reduce relapse rates and improve quality of life for everybody, in the family. And I suppose the key kind of takeaways is that, we each play a role in combating stigma. Each of us can speak the truth to that.
mm,
We each play a role in supporting creating a wellness environment. And what's our role in doing that? And I suppose it's really important to remember that, a diagnosis is only part of a person,
yeah.
or it's not all of us. It's
Mm,
it's not the whole of us. It's only a part of us. And I think, I suppose, as systemic therapists, I'd be saying we're hardwired for connection. Nature gave us this biology between, oxytocin, the love drugs, serotonin, and our mirror neurons. We're hardwired for connection, and so wellness is a team event.
okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's a really nice point to end on. So as you say, it's co-created. It's a team event. If anyone's interested in more of the ideas that you've shared here, any resources you think, we can certainly send them in the links maybe, but any books that come to mind, or we can follow up after potentially, or
Well, I saw something recently on YouTube actually. Sarah Schley is her name, Schley. She has a movie and she's been interviewed several times on it's called Brainstorm: From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum.
Okay.
And that's on YouTube, so you could have a look at that. I mean, there's your own service, your own website has lots of wonderful resources. You can check out Family Therapy Association of Ireland, of course. There's the Nonviolent Resistance Approach, Nonviolent Resistance Ireland. Um, you mentioned the mindfulness programs that you
Yeah.
offer. I think there's a website, Palouse, I think it's called Palouse, mindful-based stress reduction. That's
Yeah.
a nice one, to help us to get into that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be very helpful to notice habitual patterns, kind of mindfulness. So, and certainly, as you say, thank you for the plug there, Joanna, to the Aware website,
Yeah.
and a huge amount of resources for people to have a look at. And as I mentioned at the start, also our programs are opening for the year, so do have a look to see what might be of interest to you, what might suit you. As I said, all of these are offered free of charge, as well as counselling. So we offer up to 8 sessions for people on an individual basis. So do have a look at our website for more information. Joanna, thank you so much for this afternoon. I really enjoyed the conversation. Really, really helpful, really interesting ideas as well. So thank you for your time and your experience this afternoon. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, it's been a delight to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So moving on then to our webinar for next month. So we're going to be talking about anxiety. So what fuels it and how to manage it. So please do join us. That's on the 11th of February at 12 o'clock. And so hopefully see many of you there. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you, Joanna, and thanks everyone for joining.
Bye.